truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody, and happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day. This is one of my favorite holidays for many, many reasons. Mostly because I just love the Declaration of Independence. This podcast is called Hold These Truths. That comes from, you guessed it, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And what are these truths? These truths are derived from our Creator, as the Declaration states. And these truths means our rights, our inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's a lot to the Declaration. It's part philosophical, political. It's political philosophy, and it's mostly a long list of grievances against the British, the Americans claiming that they are actually equal and sovereign next to the British, and they have every right to self-govern, and that the list of grievances has not been addressed. And they list a whole bunch of grievances. I probably couldn't list a lot of those for you off the top of my head, because I think the most important thing about the Declaration of Independence is the philosophical statement that it makes. It tells us why government exists. Government exists to protect your inalienable rights, to protect you from others who seek to infringe on those rights. A government can only exist by the consent of the governed. It packs so much meaning into this one long sentence there, and we're going to pick it apart today. I think it's prudent. Let me read it to you first before we get into it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. There is a ton of history and a ton of meaning, philosophical underpinnings, history behind all of these words, and we're going to dive into it. We're probably not going to be able to talk about the actual revolution itself today, because there's so much to talk about why government exists, and that's the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, to tell us why government exists. The Constitution tells us how to govern. It provides that infrastructure. Hey, you're supposed to have 3 branches of government. They should have checks and balances. This is how they should vote. That's what the Constitution does. It gets more philosophical when we have the Bill of Rights, of course, and that's incredibly important. But it's the Declaration that even tells us we have rights in the first place, and that you can't argue with those rights because they come from our Creator. It's really interesting stuff. And to have that conversation, I brought an expert on it. Dr. Danielle Allen, welcome back to the show. Really glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to reintroduce you to everybody. Remember, for the audience, you were here in April, but we were talking about something totally unrelated, COVID-19. Unfortunately, that hasn't gone away, but we're not going to talk about that today. Okay. We're going to talk about what you normally work on, which is political theory. Remember, you're a professor at Harvard. You are the director of Harvard's Center for Ethics, political theorist. You've published a lot of things on democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. And given that it's the 4th of July, I would love to talk about your book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. It's a fantastic read, and I highly recommend it. So we'll start from the beginning, because you actually have a interesting reasoning as to why you wanted to write the book in the first place.
Sure, absolutely. Now, I'm glad to talk about the book, and the Declaration of Independence is literally my favorite topic. So I always welcome a chance to talk about it. I taught at the University of Chicago for a decade. And while I was there, I was very fortunate to get involved in a night program for low-income adults, a year-long humanities course where they did history, philosophy, literature, art history, and critical thinking and writing. And over the course of my time, I taught several of the units in this night course. And the goal of the night course was to give our students the same caliber of education that the day students at the University of Chicago got. Yet these were folks sometimes who hadn't even completed a high school degree or were working two jobs. So there was this real sort of conundrum of how you deliver the same quality of education in such different contexts with people with such different backgrounds. The solution was to teach the same caliber of text, high quality pieces of writing with incredibly important content. But to shrink the size, to do shorter texts. So I am going to be honest and say, from a purely pragmatic point of view, for a purely pragmatic reason, I chose to teach the Declaration of Independence, and I chose to teach it as history, chose to teach it as philosophy, as literature, to support learning about writing. But it was an electrifying experience. My night students were people who were all in that course because they wanted to change their lives. And they connected to the Declaration faster than I'd ever seen any of my day students do. They went right to the heart of its argument. It's about people who look around at their circumstances, diagnose them, identify what's wrong, and chart a path to a better future. So we just took control of that document, took ownership, took mastery, and it was an amazingly empowering learning opportunity.
That is what I tend to love about the Declaration. Is empowering is a pretty good word to describe it. And so can you actually let's go back before 1776, just a few years, or however many years you think we should go back. But when did the I guess cognitive gears start spinning in the founders' minds? What are the actions as well that led up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence? Let's frame it for the audience, the historical framing for the audience.
Sure. So I think it's fair to say that roughly a decade of work preceded the Declaration of Independence. So there was an important moment in Massachusetts in the 1760s with the writs of assistance. This was when British customs officers were given the power to search people without cause. So they could just sort of search people willy-nilly. You could sort of think of it as stop and frisk of the day. And that really ticked off a lot of resistance and resentment on the part of the colonial Americans. So they began, for that and for other reasons, there were lots of new taxes coming out of the British need to pay for the French Indian War, which had been extremely expensive. And there were lots of additional controls on American efforts to develop mercantile power and industries of various kinds. So there was a requirement, for example, that they use things that had been made in Britain, cloth, for instance, or iron and things like that, even though they were developing manufacturing capacity themselves. So there were a lot of problems in British colonial policy in the 1760s, and the Americans were routinely writing to Parliament, routinely writing to the king, submitting petition after petition, seeking an alternative landscape, an alternative legal landscape, an alternative policy landscape. So by the time they write the Declaration, they say, we've petitioned for redress of our grievances and we've been met only by repeated injury. And what they're doing is describing a 10-year process of trying for change through existing channels and finding those channels non-responsive.
And you also write about, and this started with the issue in New Hampshire where they sort of found themselves without proper governance. And I think you write about how Adams and Lee sort of figured out how to sell independence in this way by making kind of a clever argument that because the British were, I guess, retreating from their duties of governance, declaring the colonies an outright rebellion, that, well, you have no choice but to set up your own government. So don't we need independence? Am I explaining that correctly?
Yeah. Yes. No, you've got it well. So I think very often we repeat this myth that first you have revolution and then you have the work of constituting something. But that's right. Actually how it went. The relationship was actually the other way around. That is, they understood how they wanted to constitute, what they wanted to constitute before they decided to declare independence. And so, yes, I mean, what happened was there was resistance, there were uprisings, and in various ways, the British were withdrawing from their responsibilities. So in New Hampshire, the royal governor fled. New Hampshire was literally without a functioning government. The judicial system couldn't operate. That happened in June of 1775. And so the folks in New Hampshire wrote to Continental Congress and said, hey, what should we do? And Congress wrote back and said, set up a government. And so by January 1776, New Hampshire had written a constitution. That was the first state constitution. And so I think Adams and Lee, John Adams and Richard Henry Lee, Adams from Massachusetts, Lee from Virginia, together, they were pulling north and south in one direction. They had this sort of powerful insight that was the way forward. So then when the king in the fall of 1775 declared the colonies outside of his protection with regard to naval matters, maritime matters, that was their moment. They said, look, he's just declared us out of his protection on the high seas. We're not going to be protected from Spain and from France. He has as good as abandoned us. So it's on us to govern ourselves. And so New Hampshire was already at work writing that constitution. They started arguing that everybody else should start doing the same. In May, Virginia went ahead and voted on a constitution for itself. By the time we actually get to July 4th, we already have 4 or 5 colonies that have written constitutions for themselves. So they've made that commitment to governing themselves. And once they've done that and laid the foundation to do that, then they're ready to declare independence.
Yeah, it starts to become inevitable, I suppose.
Exactly. It's the thing that sort of seals the deal. But the point really is that they didn't, wake up one morning and declare independence and then figure out what to do. That's the important point, right? But they'd already the positive project of self-government before they declared independence.
Right. It was a process. And so part of that process is the Continental Congress. Can we actually, real quick, can we back up here? Can we define for the audience the Continental Congress? How was this set up? Why was this set up? What is this Continental Congress that's operating in rebellion against the British? Like, what is this?
Sure. So, as I said, in the wake of the French-Indian War, there were a lot of political difficulties between the colonies and Britain. And so different leaders in the colonies began organizing initially sort of conversation groups. So Sam Adams here in Massachusetts ran a group called the Loyal Nine, which was like his 9 buddies who'd get together and think about what's wrong with their relationship with Britain, what to do about it. And coming out of that initial kind of group, they started setting up these things called committees of correspondence all over the colonies, where they would communicate with each other and say, well, here's what's going on with us, what's going on with you, what do you see? It was grassroots organizing of the day. And so then at a certain point, there's a kind of center of gravity of agreement that there was a problem and that they wanted to be able to speak with one voice about the problem. So they decided to, from their colonies, send delegates to Philadelphia to form a Continental Congress, called that simply because it was going to cover the continent. All the colonies were going to come together and speak with a single continental voice. When they first did that, they weren't trying to set up a government separately from Britain. They just wanted to write one letter to the king instead of writing 13 letters, if you see what I mean. So you had the first Continental Congress, which basically submitted a bunch more petitions to the king, and then the second Continental Congress, which is the one that declared independence and fought the war.
Got it. And they also set up a committee. And this committee was meant to, when we finally decided to write the actual declaration. Well, there's a resolution that needs to be written first. It's kind of a complicated process that actually occurs. There's a resolution and there's a declaration. The resolution doesn't get a whole lot of attention. But who's on the committee and why?
Sure. Well, so, I just want to say out loud, they didn't just set up one committee. They're just like you guys in real Congress now, because they were Congress. They were the first Congress, and they set up loads and loads of committees. So that's sort of like what Congress was just this incredible producer of one committee after another. And in this instance, what they did was Richard Henry Lee stood up in Congress in early June to propose a resolution for independence. And that was how Congress proceeded at the time, was that first you'd have somebody propose something for people to vote on. And then if there was movement in the positive direction, you'd go ahead and have a committee assigned to draft the preamble to go with the resolution. So what Lee's resolution was is basically what is still the final paragraph of the Declaration, when they say, we therefore declare these colonies to be free and independent states. That paragraph was basically the text of his resolution. And so the committee assigned to draft the preamble, well, the way they did committees was they voted, and whoever got the most votes would be the chair of the committee. It's also important to say that at the same time, they were setting up a committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, a committee to draft the treaties with France and Spain. So the point is, there were 56 people in Congress. They had a whole lot of committees. Most of them were really, really, really busy. There was one person who wasn't very busy, who wasn't on a bunch of committees, and that was Thomas Jefferson. So John Adams was super busy. He was on a bazillion committees. He was really the leading intellectual force, along with Richard Henry Lee, behind the Declaration. He was also a real political actor. So he worked behind the scenes to sort of get folks voted onto this committee to write the preamble. He got Jefferson voted on, winning by 1 to him, Adams coming in second. Then Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. So those 5, note 1 Southerner, 4 Northerners. So it's a kind of interesting fact to register that the authors of the Declaration were a committee that spanned the colonies. Jefferson got to be chair, and as chair, you get to actually be in charge of the literal writing out of the text. And that was mainly because he was young and not on a lot of committees.
Yeah, he was 32, which is incredible. Yeah, it's not that young. I'm 36. Wow. Come on.
Okay, no comment. Okay. From an older person.
Yeah, you're not. I won't ask.
I'm old enough. Exactly.
The committee work was incredible. And John Adams basically said to Jefferson, you're going to write it because you're a great writer. Adams wrote, and you have it here in your book, the conversation that he had with Jefferson. Adams, I will not do it. You shall do it. Jefferson, oh no. Why will you not? You ought to do it. Adams, I will not. Jefferson, why? Adams, reasons enough. This is just a hilarious conversation.
Exactly.
Jefferson, what can be your reasons? Adams, reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of the business. Reason second, I'm obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, and you are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Jefferson, well, if you are decided, I will do as well as I can. I wonder how the guy, I don't know. I had to read that out loud because
I love it too. Yeah,
funny,
it's great.
Like 18th century conversation.
And so Jefferson, accurate, honestly, it's a really powerful, accurate statement of facts on the ground.
Yeah.
If I may, Virginia was the most populous state. And in various ways, it was closer to Britain. Massachusetts had been pestering Britain for quite some time. So for Virginia to come around and also be in favor of independence was a very significant political thing, hence the importance of having Jefferson at the head of the committee. And yes, Adams was this rabble-rouser, so he is describing himself accurately there.
So I want to read the first draft that Jefferson wrote, and it's going to sound kind of familiar to people, but obviously wrong. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive in rights with inherent and inalienable, that among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that's not exactly how it ended up. And so I love what you wrote here, how this messy work, where we obviously know that the final draft was, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so they changed sacred and undeniable to self-evident. And you've got to wonder, how do you think that conversation went between Adams and Jefferson? And Benjamin Franklin was also on this committee as well. But how do you think that conversation went? And why did they want to change it? Do you think it was word flow? Do you think it just sounded better? Do you think there was deeper meaning? You go into a lot of detail on the deeper meaning behind the word self-evident. So, But do you think they had that conversation?
I think they do. They were working so hard on these questions, and they weren't just working on them in the context of this moment of writing. They've been working on them for months. Adams really first starts sketching out ideas that show up in the Declaration in letters in November, and then he writes a version of the Declaration for Massachusetts in January 1776. He has another pamphlet in April, which also has a lot of the content of the Declaration in it. So basically, they've been giving this so much thought. And the question of what's sacred does matter to them. They also recognize that they have a hugely diverse population. Jefferson is really writing as a deist, or that, of uncertain religious persuasion or conviction. Adams is a practicing Christian. So they are collectively working their way towards compromise language. Franklin is a Quaker, very different in kind from Sherman, who is a very austere Puritan. And so we end up with a language of the creator as the source for rights, where the creator is not given any specific doctrinal link or association, and where the creator is also linked up with nature, so that people have kind of two different ways they can understand the foundation of our rights, the source of our rights. And so what they ultimately do is they distinguish the source of our rights from the things we should understand about our rights. And the things we should understand about our rights are a matter of logic. And that's where the concept of self-evidence comes in. And it's a really important word, because what it's actually doing is naming the structure of that all-important second sentence of the Declaration. That's the "we hold these truths" sentence. And so the point they're making about truth is that you can see sets of logical relations among things such that conclusions necessarily follow. So basically, you've got this premise: people have rights. Here are some examples: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Second premise: governments are instituted among humankind to secure those rights. And then those premises deliver a conclusion. So if governments are supposed to secure rights, all people have rights, well then, if those governments aren't securing rights, it's the right of the people also to alter or to abolish them. So in other words, what they're doing is using logical inference to draw a right of revolution out of some premises that they take to be true. So they're separating, there's a sort of source of truth that comes from logic. That's what's captured in that sentence. And then there's the question of what's the source of our rights? And that's what comes from the creator or nature, depending on how you want to look at it. So they were really very careful about their justifications for things. That's what we see happening as they make those edits and revisions.
Yeah, it's true. They don't. If you're reading it, it's obvious that they're talking about God, but it's not necessarily a specific religion. It's not tied to a specific religion, and they were careful about that. And Jefferson has a very interesting, set of religious beliefs. He wrote his own version of the Bible. They call it the Jefferson Bible, but you note that he called it something different. I don't have it in front of me. But the point is that they come from something higher than just your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't derive these rights just by opinion alone, because, well, if that were true, then they could just be changed quickly and radically. And I think human history would back that notion up quite easily. So this is also a good time, I think, to talk about the philosophical underpinnings of why they wrote these words. It's not like the founders just figured this stuff out all of a sudden. They were very well educated. They were very well read on history and philosophy. And I missed it in the book, but I remember you talking about this at a talk you gave about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why those three things? And the origination from John Locke's Life, Liberty, and Property.
Yes, no, that's a good point. It's funny because that was some work I ended up doing after the book came out. So if I were ever to do a revised edition of the book, this would be a section that would go in. So the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is hugely important, obviously. And it is a moment of a really fundamental choice. The tradition coming out of Enlightenment philosophy for talking about rights, and for example, from the work of the English philosopher John Locke, have been to argue that the fundamental rights were life, liberty, and property. And over the course of 1775 and 1776, the Americans were having a debate about this. They were having a debate about how they wanted to describe their fundamental purposes and aspirations. The debate had already gotten seized up with and massively confounded by the problem of enslavement. In the fall of 1775, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had decreed that any enslaved person who escaped and fought for the British would be freed. And from that point on, the Virginians were arguing that the king was violating their rights of property. So the right of property, the defense of the right of property, became closely associated with the defense of enslavement. And Benjamin Franklin notes this in the debates about the Articles of Confederation. So while this is happening, John Adams is working really hard to try to figure out what the right way is of talking about what they're all about. And he starts really pursuing the happiness concept and writing about it. And when he does that, what he's drawing on is another part of the philosophical tradition, partly drawing from philosophy. So Aristotle, for example, from the Greeks, Cicero from the Romans, and then also in important ways for him specifically from religious traditions and texts. So that concept that comes from Aristotle and Cicero about happiness is a big concept about human flourishing and well-being. It's about the idea of a life well lived. It's not a hedonistic pleasure concept. It's
Right.
really a concept that's about, if I get to the end of my life and look back, how will I know that I had a life well lived? That's what happiness is fundamentally about. And so for them, that means concepts like virtues of various kinds, living well, treating others well, having positive and healthy relationships with other people, and that kind of thing. And so then Adams makes this argument in April 1776 in this pamphlet called Some Thoughts Concerning Government that the object of all government is the same as the object of life for all human beings, and that's happiness. And you can see the debate coming together at this point, because then in Virginia, when they draft their Constitution and their Declaration of Rights, when George Mason drafts that, he argues exactly for life, liberty, property, and securing happiness. He puts the whole package together in two. So that means between May, when Mason and I sat in Virginia, and July, when Congress passes the Declaration, the debate is over, do we put property and happiness both in, or do we just use happiness? And so in the end, they just use happiness. That is a really important anti-enslavement moment in the Declaration, because it means they were really pushing out what had become the anchor term for a defense of enslavement. There is also a moment where they compromise on behalf of the slave faction. So you have both voices in the Declaration, but it's really important to see that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was anchoring space for the anti-enslavement position.
And that was a conscious decision?
A conscious decision. I mean, yes, when you look at all the minutes and notes, so for example, in the debates about the Articles of Confederation, property comes up, and the question is like, are they going to put property in the text as a kind of specific term? And Franklin says, like, we can't use it, because when it comes up, it just is about slavery. So we can't. There's too much controversy that is connected to this term. So that's how we know that they were very explicit and self-conscious about how the right to property had become very closely entangled with the defense of enslavement. Adams never owned slaves. He was not an enslaver. Benjamin Franklin had enslaved people earlier in his life, and he became an abolitionist. He became an active advocate of abolition. So in that committee working on the Declaration, you have people who already had different positions on enslavement. Both Adams and Franklin in various ways would help advance the end of enslavement in their states. And both Massachusetts and Pennsylvania had achieved that by the early 1780s.
And on that subject, Jefferson had a whole paragraph in the original Declaration on a vehemently anti-slavery paragraph that was taken out, not by the committee, but by the Continental Congress as a whole.
That's right. Yes. So there's a paragraph that refers to the sacred rights of life and liberty. It's that same vocabulary as you quoted before of Africans and the way in which the sacred rights of life and liberty were violated by the slave trade. So the committee endorsed that language. Even Jefferson, he is the mystery figure in all of this. How could he have written and or endorsed language like that, given his own status as an enslaver? But at any rate, then yes, Congress took that paragraph out, but Congress also endorsed the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness phrase. So the Declaration has its compromises around enslavement in it in the same way that the Constitution did.
And so what are your explanations? Because Jefferson is that mystery man. And you write about this in the book and try to figure out and contextualize what's actually happening there. He clearly intended to write a legal document that would be used as an abolitionist document, and yet he himself owned slaves. And so does this hypocrisy, I think, drives people crazy when they study the founders. It's clearly it's clearly front and center in our country right now, that the hypocrisy of historical figures who could do great things but be sinners themselves. And so how do how do we tease that out?
Sure. Well, there's a lot to say about this. So let me say maybe three things, two general, one about Jefferson. So the first general thing is to say that sometimes we tried to deal with the past by saying, oh, well, they couldn't have known any better. It was just the times. So that's actually not true, just because there were people already in the 1760s, 1770s who were arguing against enslavement. James Otis, another Bostonian who gave us the fight against taxation without representation, that was his cause, also wrote one of the first abolitionist pamphlets and was very explicit that when he talked about the rights of British subjects, that included black and white. He says that explicitly. So the point is just that there was already a choice to be made about who counted under the big banner of universal human rights, and people made choices. So we have to accept that. People chose wrongly in some cases. That's point one. Point two, however, is that it's not actually our job to judge our ancestors. We need to understand, do they choose rightly or wrongly? But it's not really our job to be their final judges. They have met their judgment day. That is not for us. For us is to think about our own moral positions and responsibilities. That's where our moral work comes in, our behavior, our relations to others. So then the third point about Jefferson, if we just try to understand Jefferson, my judgment is he made the wrong decision, but nonetheless, let's understand what his decision is, or was rather. And I think basically what it came down to was this. I think he did, in fact, think that all human beings had, as he wrote, sacred and undeniable rights, and that included people in Africa. But at the same time that he believed that all people had rights and that all people should have governments that secured their rights, he didn't think that all people should do that together. Okay? So in other words, I think what he was trying to articulate was a separate but equal doctrine before its time. In other words, he was fine with the idea that Africans should go back to Africa and have a government in Africa, right? They had rights, they should have their governments and so forth, but that they should do separately from what white people would do in his society. So he had a strong racialist picture at the same time that he had a universalist picture. And I think he squared those things in his own mind with this notion that there could be separate communities for different people, each of which separate communities delivered rights to those people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the way I kind of describe this too is, civilization is an ongoing project, and civilization in its best form, I think, tempers the worst of human nature. There's some people believe human nature can be changed by good and just institutions. I'm not one of those people. Human nature is pretty consistent throughout time. And I think the founders inherently understood that fact about human nature, and they wanted to institute the best framework that they could to limit the excesses of the worst of human nature. And but like I said, civilization is constantly evolving, and with it, better tools with which to subjugate the worst instincts of human nature. And in this case, in the case of slavery or even racial tensions, it's that in-group loyalty sense that we have, and we are born with it. And civilization and the free market, this sort of exchange of goods and labor without having to beat somebody up for it, it individualizes people. And I think that's the key insight of the Enlightenment and the founding, is this philosophical point, is that everybody is an individual, everybody is equal, or created equal, not same, but created equal with equal rights, and able to engage freely with one another and protect their own life, liberty, and property,
and pursue
of happiness. Well, property in our modern sense, because we can say that now. I say it all the time, life, liberty, and property, because it doesn't have that meaning anymore.
Sure. Yeah.
But back then it did, and it's so interesting that they took that out. So because they wanted the Declaration to be an abolitionist document, I find that fascinating. And it was used, as you've noted, it was used as an abolitionist document right after that. And I guess, but going back to my main point, that the civilization is constantly evolving, and so yes, we can judge and say people were wrong to do things at a certain time, but it should always be contextualized with civilization was still evolving to the point where it hadn't rooted out all of these bad things yet. And a bit of grace with how we look at people might be in order.
So you've said lots of important things there, and I want to respond to some of them, if that's okay. So just a small clarification. I wouldn't actually go so far as to say that that all of Congress working together wanted to produce a document that would be an abolitionist document.
Oh, of course not. No.
There were people in the group for whom that was an important thing, to leave open the space for abolitionism, and they achieved that in a kind of compromise context. I guess that's how I would put it. And indeed, abolitionists saw the value of the document and were using it immediately from January of 1777 forward. But to your philosophical point, so I think you've said something really helpful and valuable, the point about individualization as a way of breaking through the inflexibility, the sometimes inflexibility of in-group loyalties. I think that's true, but I think there's more to be said. So psychologists and sociologists have been able to really study in-group loyalties and have been able to observe that there's really different categories. There are in-group loyalties that are connected to things like opportunity hoarding and aversion to outgroups, actual positive aversion to outgroups. And then there are other kinds of in-group loyalties that are about a certain kind of affinity, sense of sharing, but are actually disconnected from that negative view of outgroups. And so that's what I find really interesting, the question of how do we cultivate those kinds of social connections, those sort of birds of a feather social connections of people to one another that are the version that are not connected to negative views on outgroups. Because at the end of the day, none of us is an atomistic individual. We do all live in social connections. In that regard, I am a deeply Aristotelian thinker and recognize that human beings are social creatures, social animals. And so our job is really to figure out, how to activate individual self-governance and an individual's commitment to crafting their own life course, but it's also how to sustain a network of associations and a life of communities that is, in that positive way, supportive of the communities of others also. So that is the sort of circle that I think we're trying to square.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I want to get to your book is called In Defense of Equality, or the subtitle. So we haven't talked about your analysis of the word equality as it pertains to the Declaration. And so there's 4 facets of equality that you mentioned. What are those, and what's your general take and analysis on equality in the Declaration?
Sure. No, thank you. So the Declaration starts and ends with the concept of equality. People often forget that. So in the very first sentence, what the members of Congress say is that they want to claim their separate and equal place on the world stage among nations. They want their separate and equal place among nations. And so when they're saying that, they're making a point about what independence means for a society. They want to have sovereignty. And that concept of sovereignty is about not being dominated by the other powers of the earth. So at the very beginning there, they lay a claim to equality, which is about a concept of non-domination. And then that concept of equality about self-sovereignty is one that they then apply to themselves as individuals too. As individuals, they want to be equal to one another in not being dominated by each other. And so that's why they want a structure of rights, so that they can all pursue their life courses, pursue their happiness as free equals to one another. So that's the first way equality comes up. The second way equality comes up is in the "we hold these truths to be self-evident" sentence, where all men are created equal. And that is a claim about moral equality. So whereas the first thing I just described was about political equality, the second way it comes up is about moral equality. We human beings all have the same capacity inside us, and this is that capacity to diagnose our circumstances and to set a course to ensure that tomorrow is better than yesterday. We may exercise that capacity at different levels of success, but we all have that capacity. We all have the capacity to be judges of our circumstances. That's the second way equality comes up. The third way is in the list of grievances that they introduce in their complaints about the king. So this list of grievances is made out of the contributions of people all over the colonies. And the members of Congress even put advertisements in newspapers saying to ordinary members of their society, write us letters, tell us what you're seeing about what's going on with Britain. In other words, this was a kind of equality about knowledge sharing. They recognized everybody in their society might have something useful to share, some useful bit of perspective. It's kind of like a potluck approach to knowledge creation.
Or Facebook.
Beautiful. Well, yes, exactly. But without curation, right? Facebook, no curation. Congress is also a mediating vehicle here. So everybody can contribute something, and then we in Congress will synthesize and interpret and try to make sure it's curated at the end of the day. But that is a very democratic approach to knowledge generation and development, very egalitarian. So that's the third way. The fourth way is when they define the king, the tyrant, as somebody who has not been responsive to their needs, that they've reached out with petitions seeking redress, and he's only responded by repeated injury. And that's a really powerful point, because it makes the point that equality and freedom, or rather freedom, is about sort of reciprocity and responsiveness. If I've got a grievance, I need responsiveness. And that balancing of exchanges is a fourth facet of equality. And then the last one, I'm sorry I'm taking so long about this, but it's also important. The last facet of equality is when, at the very end of the Declaration, they mutually pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to one another. In other words, they are in this together. They're going to invest their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Like everything they have, they're going to co-invest in a set of political institutions of which they're going to be co-owners. So this is a thing I just think it's so important for people to recognize. When you look at your state capitol building, when you look at your courthouses, when you look at any of your public offices, when you look at the White House, when we look at the U.S. Capitol building, this is an incredible body of assets, okay? They actually increase the quality of our life on every dimension: economic, social, educational, you name it. These are assets that are delivering well-being. Who owns those assets? We, the people. We are all equal co-owners of those assets. And that's what they were really saying, that there's that kind of equality of co-ownership of our political institutions when they mutually pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to one another.
Yeah, and they certainly did that. I mean, I don't have any of the stats right in front of me, but many of the signers of the Declaration some were killed, some were had their homes burned to the ground. They were truly hunted. I mean, it was interesting that they did not sign this anonymously. It was, in effect, a death warrant.
It was very courageous, and I mean that they had made their decision. There was no turning back at that point. And so, I mean, there were members of Congress who chose not to sign, and they left at that point. That was the point at which they, got on a ship and went back to Britain, basically. So, that was the turning point moment. You were picking a side at that point.
Yeah, and you're carefully to define equality, and I think you need to be careful to define equality. And I certainly don't have any disagreements with the way you do it. It's an interesting number of facets here. So again, one, political. Everybody should have the equal political representation. Everybody should have equal moral rights, equal right to pursue their happiness and decide what happiness means to them. I think that's really interesting. And I didn't actually quite understand what you meant by the development of collective intelligence until you just said it now. And it's what we do on a daily basis. We collect constituent input, and sometimes some of the best ideas for legislation actually do come from local constituents. And so
exactly,
it's this sort of this bottom-up democratic process that is quite interesting. Reciprocity is a really interesting one. The way, and this may be the one where I think people, if people, I'm sure everybody's got complaints about everything, but if there's one that I can see people having a complaint about now and feeling like we're not living up to this sort of practice of reciprocity, to confront each other on equal footing, especially between government and citizen, I think this one would be it. The tensions with police right now
Yep.
are clearly that's the complaint.
Yep.
If you're a libertarian, the complaint is that the government and the regulatory system can just beat you over the head, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't possibly muster the resources to fight the government when they won't sign your permit. We just won't do it. Why? And like if there's work to be done, it's here perhaps. And this is the story of America, right? We wrote down these incredible ideas, and they came in a time that wasn't ready for them. But when is society ready for landmark ideas? And we spent quite a bit of time actually trying to live up to this notion of true equality. And in the ways I just mentioned, I suppose we still are. Although while we have come a long way, there's always work to be done. It's so important to define it, though, and the
Yep.
standards, right? And this is the lack of conversation I see happening now, is lack of definition. I feel like we're ghost hunting oftentimes, and so it's so important to understand what we mean by equality in a philosophical sense, so that we actually know what we're striving for.
Yep. No, I appreciate your saying that. I mean, I think that was really what motivated me to write the book, was this real frustration about the way in which it often felt that people were sparring over boogeymen, that there were sort of words being bandied about, but nobody actually knew what they meant, and labels slapped on people, again, mainly for the point of demonizing. And this went both directions, both sides sort of to each other. So yes, I wanted to lay out space for careful thought. And I also, our foundation rests on the linkages between freedom and equality, the fact that these are mutually reinforcing ideas. And it was astonishing to me that we had gotten ourselves to a place in our country where we thought we had to pick between freedom and equality, as if you were for freedom, you couldn't be for equality, and as if you were for equality, you couldn't be for freedom. And this sort of sense of opposition had begun to track our party politics, and I just found this incomprehensible, basically. And so I wanted to go through carefully and show people how freedom and equality belong together.
Well, yeah, the case, and I wanted to address that because you called it an anti-libertarian case, and I actually disagree, because the case you make would not be objectionable to a libertarian. I think the libertarian argument, and even the conservative argument, would say that depending on how you define equality, it can be at odds with freedom. But if you're defining equality correctly, and I think you do, then then it is not at odds with freedom. And in fact, we would agree with you that it is necessary it is a necessary foundation for freedom. Because if you don't have these tenets of equality, well, then the obvious outcome of that would be that somebody infringes on your freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. And I take the point. And I think then, maybe it is my not having seen the places where that view was articulated from a libertarian perspective. And if it's out there, that'd be great to have that lifted up, where libertarians are explaining the place of equality in their framework, because I think it would be beneficial for all of us to be able to see that.
Yeah, okay. I could send you a bunch of stuff. I don't know. It's when they mean equity, I think, they mean everybody gets the same thing. I mean, they mean we're going to try and take from one group and give to another. They view that as an infringement on freedom, for the sake of making people more equal. But I just don't think that's what you're saying here.
Well, it's true that in my book, I don't address economic questions. And so I think once we can see how liberty and equality are mutually necessary for each other, when you're focused on definitions of equality that are political equality, moral equality, that concept of reciprocity and responsiveness, that democratic approach to knowledge generation, and social equality. If we have agreement there, then the next conversation is, okay, well, so where does the economic picture fit in? How do we talk about that? And I would be in agreement with libertarians that any effort to achieve a kind of perfect material equality in distribution is an infringement of freedom that's problematic. It's problematic in other ways as well. I think it is not the best way of delivering a prosperous economy, for example. So I would be in agreement there. But then I think there's another conversation to be had about, well, what are our goals for the economy? And I think it is reasonable to say that we do need an economy that is egalitarian in its rough results to support the other kinds of equality. So that doesn't mean that you have to be using redistributive tools to achieve that. I think there are other mechanisms that can make an economy more egalitarian or less egalitarian. And I think For example, if you look at the way George Marshall thought about rebuilding European economies after World War II, he was really focused on the question of what kind of underlying economic infrastructure do you need to support societies of free self-government? And I feel like that's the question we should be collectively asking, and that we haven't been asking enough.
Yeah. It's a longer conversation, but the point is, and I think the point of this conversation is that the philosophical foundations have to be solid first, and then you can move into that in a reasonable way. I think you and I probably could. I think our nation has failed to do that, unfortunately, and we need to get back to it. We need to start to agree again on basic definitions and foundations.
You and I should at some point try to have a conversation about economic questions and just see where.
Yeah.
Let's find out where are the divergences and agreements and so forth. That would be super interesting.
It would be. You mentioned it a couple times in your book. You talk about zoning laws, increased social connectedness across socioeconomic and ethnic differences. I'm all about repealing zoning laws. So easy. Houston doesn't have zoning laws.
Right.
That comes with some problems. Yeah, it comes with some problems, but mostly it means lower housing prices and more mixed neighborhoods. It's pros and cons, but it works. And one interesting thing too, maybe that is what creates this increased social connectedness that you talk about. And I didn't see any like policies associated with that idea, but maybe the lack of zoning laws automatically creates that. And Houston also stands out as a major city, and it is the most diverse city in America. And it also stands out as a major city that has not seen the kind of, let's call it mayhem that has occurred throughout the country. And maybe there's reasons for that. The way people live together and respect each other. I don't know. I'm sure the causality is extremely complex.
Super interesting. Yep. Nope, sorry.
I wanted to go back to the 1770s and 1780s here, and to just really kind of hit this question that irks everybody. Again, that the question of historical hypocrisy. Why didn't we? If we were a good country, why didn't we abolish slavery right away? And this is what's on everybody's mind right now. There's a couple things in your chapter, If Actions Speak Louder Than Words. If you could lay out some of the things that they did try to do, and to right this wrong.
Sure. Well, I mean, we have to simply accept the fact that our country has committed great wrongs. Right? There's just actually no way around accepting that. So I think I always end up feeling slightly puzzled about the structure of this kind of conversation. So I think the harder thing is, how do you love a place that has done wrong in this kind of way? And but I also think that shouldn't be hard either, in the sense that we all, anybody look at their extended family. We all have people in our extended family who have done wrong. We love them anyway, right? We can love and forgive and try to redeem. And I think that is basically the story here. So, there were people already working on abolition in the 1770s, as I mentioned. And Prince Hall, a free African American in Boston, used the language of the Declaration of Independence to submit a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly in January of 1777 and moved abolition forward there. It was achieved by the early 1780s in Massachusetts. Also, I mentioned Pennsylvania, Vermont too. Vermont wasn't a state yet. And in all those cases, the language of the Declaration was influential and helpful to achieving that. So, the engines of change were in gear, but it was also the case that there were vast swaths of the country where a sort of deep kind of culture of racial superiority had taken hold. And then fear about insurrection and uprising from enslaved populations really entrenched that. I think sometimes what we don't see is the way in which domination, so when one group dominates another, is actually corrosive for the people who are doing the dominating. It makes them feel unsafe and exacerbates fear, and fear is morally corrosive. So we have a kind of deep, sort of cultural habits that we have to uproot and move beyond. And so in that regard, we are collectively at work on a process of achieving transformation for all of ourselves together. That is a work of forgiveness, but it's also forgiveness that has to be connected to transformation. So it's not kind of forgiveness in the sense of a kind of blank free pass, everything's okay now, let's move forward. We really have to, I think, focus on the question of social equality. So for generations, we focused on formal civil rights, legal rights, and that sort of thing, and that has been fundamental. But you can think of the country as having a political constitution and a social constitution. We've made huge strides on the political constitution. At this point, I think what we're seeing and hearing around us, the voices rising up are saying our political constitution has actually gotten ahead of our social constitution. Our political constitution is more robust, more inclusive, more successful than our social constitution. And it's time for us to really look into our hearts at our social constitution, our basic habits of interacting with each other, to see if we can build something there that lives up to what we have already built with our political constitution.
And that's the goal, is to live up to the symbol of the American flag, the Union, I would call it.
The Union, yep.
And live up to the Declaration of Independence, because these things are good. That's exactly the right way to put it. The political constitution has always, in America, been well ahead of social constitutions, as you call it. And it's hard to imagine a world where that's never the case. But I mean, we're always striving to get there. We're striving to match those things.
I would actually put it slightly differently, to be honest, Congressman, in the sense, I think in the beginning, I think our political constitution and our social constitution were aligned. Our political constitution had the compromises in it at the 3/5 clause, for instance. It treated Indigenous Americans as adversaries to be dealt with entirely through treaty and war structures. So the political constitution actually, at that moment, matched up with the social constitution. And we've transformed our political constitution with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, with the Inclusion Act giving citizenship to Native Americans in the early 20th century, with the various acts around voting for Native Americans, for African Americans, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, et cetera, and with important legal decisions. So we literally have rebuilt our political constitution in ways that have moved it far away from that original moment. And so in that regard, I think the question of alignment with our social constitution is more complicated. I think we desire to have a social constitution that lives up to our new literal structure of our institutions. And I think that's what we're struggling with. I think it's that gap. In other words, not a gap between our original ideals and the present, but a gap between our renovated institutions and our social constitution.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think I don't know how much time you have left. I think we're running out, actually. Maybe we'll have to end there. But I guess, do you think our current conversation and debate about the social constitution, let's call it, is healthy? Because it's again, the thing that frightens me the most is there's in the conversation about the social constitution, there's a direct backlash against the political constitution and the meaning of America herself. And I think that strikes me as inherently unhealthy. And are we having a healthy conversation about this at the moment? Because I would argue it doesn't appear that way.
Well, one of the reasons I want to make the distinction between the political constitution and the social constitution is so that people can see more clearly what each is. So, for example, there's been this big debate this year coming out of the New York Times, the 1619 Project, which is wanted to say the real founding of the U.S. was in 1619 when enslavement started. And I would say that's when the social constitution was founded, but the political constitution was founded in 1776 and then 1787, 88. And so the important thing to recognize is that both of those founding moments matter. And they have been aligned or not aligned in different ways over time. So we can look at the political constitution now, and as you pointed out with our conversation about reciprocity, there are things we need to do to improve it, right? So the issues of policing are real. The issues of regulatory sort of arbitrariness or rigidity are real, right? We need to address those things in our political constitution, but we can also see the way in which we have indeed transformed our political constitution and achieved something quite different from what existed in 1788. There's our social constitution. And so let's focus on that, but let's be able to have separate judgments about the political constitution and the social constitution. That's why, for me, that distinction between the two is so important.
It's a great way to put it. I'm going to use that from now on to try and explain this, because I think it is the right way to put it. It's why leaders like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, they looked to, and Frederick Douglass said this, he called the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence these glorious liberty documents that you are not living up to. And the social constitution was not catching up to the political side, and you're hypocrites for not living up to it. And that was his declaration. But he, in doing that, and Martin Luther King in the same way, is he said, I have a dream that all men are created equal, that we're actually living up to these rights, and that our social side actually catches up. Well, in that case, the political side as well. I mean, they were both catching up to the promises of the founding documents. And we have to wrap ourselves in that correct American story. The American story was written as an ideal that we have to live up to, but to tear down that ideal, I think is the complete wrong approach. And I think talking about it the way you do, I think there's a sense of clarification there that I think is rather useful. And as you've noted, there's different strands of history, and maybe we simplify it all a little way too much.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we do desperately need a shared history, and that history needs to be simultaneously honest and empowering. And one of the things it needs to be empowering of is our broad collective mutual commitment to one another and to American constitutional democracy.
That's a great place to end. Dr. Danielle Allen, thank you so much for being on, and I hope everybody enjoys that extremely important discussion on this extremely important day on an extremely important document. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman. Very good to speak with you.